Hi, my name is Brittany, and for my final project, I will be presenting on the difference between two family sitcoms called One Day at a Time and Blackish. To give you a little context on each of these shows, we're going to start with One Day at a Time. One Day at a Time was a remake of a show that aired from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. They redid it so it focused on a Cuban-American family, which has a lot to do with the show and the way that it portrays certain social issues. This started off as a Netflix show, and it ran there for about 3 seasons before it got canceled and ultimately picked up by Pop TV. And then we have Blackish, which focuses on an African-American family. It first aired in 2015 and has continued to be on primetime television ever since then. So starting off with some similarities both of these shows have. Both of these shows are family focused, meaning they all surround a family. It's not just about one person in the family or about a group of friends. It is about each and every single one of their families, so the people that they call husbands, wives, stuff like that. They both consist of specific minority families. So for One Day at a Time, we have the Cuban American family, and then for Blackish, there's an African American family, which you don't see very much on primetime television, especially back in 2014 when Blackish aired, and that Netflix hadn't really done a sitcom about a minority family, which is why One Day at a Time was so important. They both do have they both are episodic, so you can go and watch any one of these shows and not be completely lost, but there are some elements in each of the shows that run like serial. For example, we have Elena, who is a character in One Day at a Time. From the start of the season, they want to put on a quinceañera for her, and she doesn't want that. So that runs through the show. And for Blackish, a lot of what they're trying to do or trying to portray is the African American family fitting into a culture that is non-predominantly African American. One of the last things that I found really similar was the camera work in each of these shows is very similar. They both have like multi-camera viewing. It's very much like a normal comedy show. So one of the most important differences from these two shows are the way the cultures impact what they are showing. These shows are about two different minority families, and that really has a lot to do with what they portray on each show. For One Day at a Time, it's very based on a Cuban American family, the Cuban American experience, and you can see that throughout the show. Even the decor and the settings, it's very what you would picture as a Hispanic family or a Cuban American family. They have a lot of themes within that. Like I said earlier, there was the quinceañera. They talk about immigration issues. They talk about one of the characters, so the grandma getting legal citizenship. I think that's in the second season. They often talk about many social issues that have to do with being Cuban Mexican or Cuban American in America. And then for Blackish, this is based more on the African American experience. So even at the start of the show, it entered with the family entering, and it was kind of how they adapt to that experience of being one of the only African American families throughout their neighborhood. That shows a lot more within the entire show. They have very much a different culture, and it's very prominent in the show that they are an African American family, and they don't try to stray from that or hide from that at all. The culture differences of these shows also impact the way they use comedy. They both have specific targeted audiences, and the ethnicities just have a lot to do with what their comedy consists of. So for Blackish, this is like literally the first episode, the screen cap that I have, they have like a little title card. It's called The Mythical and Majestic Black Family in the white neighborhood. So basically the setup is they're taking a bunch of white people on a tour to see this African American family and how they're normal, or like normal in the sense that they're not stereotypical or what people portray African Americans to be. So that is something that is in the show. They also play with just stereotypes a lot. So one of the shows, or one of the episodes, they have the parents have a conflict on whether or not to spank their kids. In the show, you can see that they're trying to portray like a stereotype of what typical, or what typical shows show of African American families, and the aggression that they typically show, stereotyping these African American people. And in this show, they really tried to break from that. And that's just one example. There's not very many stereotypes from the way that they talk, from the way they walk, from where they work. It's just really trying to break those stereotypes, and I think they use that comedy a lot within the show. And then we have One Day at a Time, whose comedy also focuses a lot on the Cuban American experience. One of the running jokes that they have within the show, or they have a couple, but one is with the grandma and her accent. They make fun of the way that she talks just because she has a very thick accent, and sometimes they can't understand what she's saying. And then we also have another character who is white, who tries often to break his character and try to fit in with the family by portraying to be Puerto Rican. That really is a main focus within this show, and I'd say that's one of the big differences in how the comedy of these shows are very different. The last difference I'm going to talk about within these shows is the social issues that each of these shows choose to portray. For One Day at a Time, they really do focus on immigration a lot. We have, in the first season, one of Elena's friends, who is the daughter in the show, her parents get deported, and we have this young girl who has grown up her entire life in America, struggling to find some place to live without her parents, and she really tries to lean on the family that the show's focused on. In the end, she does get sent away to her uncle in Texas, but it is just a realistic way to portray immigration and how it affects children who have only known America. And then we also have something else that goes on in season 2, which I talked about earlier, is the grandmother fighting to stay in America legally. So she goes through the entire immigration process, and she goes into the test and all of the classes and stuff to become an actual American citizen. At the end of season 2, they do provide that for her of being an American citizen and how joyous it was, but we also get to see her struggles throughout the entirety of the season on how long it took for her to finish that process. And of course, they use comedy to overcome all of these issues that would be hard for any other family, but it is still something that is very prominent within the show. And One Day at a Time also really focuses on PTSD, anxiety, depression, all that stuff. The mother in the show is someone who went to war and came back, so we do see her struggle a lot, especially in the first episode. They don't shy away from any of that, and I think it's just a testament of everything that the show is willing to cover. And then for Blackish, we really have them focused more on African American social issues. So even the very first episode and throughout the season, we have a racial divide that is covered within the show. Obviously, it's covered by comedy, so it's not entirely serious. But since that is the first season and the very first episode, I don't think they delved too deep into stuff like that because it was primetime television. later on in the show, they do tackle things such as the Black Lives Matter movement. They do have an episode focused on how this impacts the family as African Americans, and how this impacts the people that it actually happens to in their community. They also talk about the election of Donald Trump and how that affects them as an African American family. So just throughout all both of these shows, they do tackle different social issues, but it's in a way where comedy can be introduced into each of these shows.